Good morning again and welcome. Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I am Myrtle Dorsey, Chair-elect of the American Association of Community Colleges Board of Directors and Chancellor of Baton Rouge Community College in Louisiana. As a courtesy to all our attendees, please turn off all cell phones or put them on silent. I am pleased to be here today, and I am honored to introduce our speaker for this session. David Wessel is the economics editor for the Wall Street Journal and writes the Capital column, a weekly look at the economy and forces shaping living standards around the world. He is responsible for overseeing coverage of the Federal Reserve and the overall economy. And I don't think he has any money on him, so the winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes and the co-author of the book Prosperity, and he also frequently appears on National Public Radio. David is a member of the advisory committee of the Journal of Economic Perspectives. He serves as a member of the Committee for Economic Development's Research Advisory Board and the Advisory Board of the Community College Research Center at Columbia University. When it comes to community colleges, David gets it. With the economy as the #1 issue on many minds in this room and on Capitol Hill, David will help us understand that community colleges can and should be doing to ensure our economic vitality now and after the economic storm subsides. I would like to start a campaign, as I've started at my own home institution, and that is to make Economics 101 a requirement under the general education requirements, because I think it's critical for our students to understand the importance of economics in this world today. Please join me in welcoming David Wessel.
Good morning. I'm from the press. I'm here to help you. And let me tell you something, you guys need help. You represent what have become the twin evils in Washington these days: government and spending. And some of you, even taxes. In case you haven't noticed, things are a lot different in Washington than they were, say, 2 years ago when you came here. And I think the most dramatic illustration of that is this morning, that we have dueling proposals from a Democratic president and a Republican House majority to see which one can cut Pell Grants more. The Republicans on the Appropriations Committee are talking about an $845 cut in the Pell Grant, and the president's budget, which is out this morning, proposes to eliminate the Pell Grant money for summer students. If you need any other reminders about the stakes that you face when you're here today, I can't think of one. Now, what I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about the economy and a little bit about community colleges and where I think you fit in the puzzle. And then I want to leave time for questions, because I'm sure there are things that you have on your mind that didn't occur to me you'd be interested in this morning. I'm sorry you couldn't get a bigger room. I feel like I'm speaking in a hockey rink here, but if you're in the back, hi. And there's empty, like in church, there's empty pews up in the front. Okay, so let's think for a minute about where the economy is. It's better than it was a couple of years ago. It's not good, but it's better. I mean, 2 years ago at this time, at the beginning of February 2009, we were not sure we had avoided a second Great Depression. Today, we are sure. We've dodged that bullet or that bomb. But yeah, that's a good thing. And it's important to remember that, because even though it would make a lousy bumper sticker, the fact is it could have been worse. But it's still not very good. There are 6.3 million Americans out of work today who have been out of work for 6 months. 4.4 million of them have been out of work for at least a year, and those are the ones who say they're still looking. We lost about 8 million jobs in the recession, and we've got about maybe 1 million back so far. At this rate, and at the rate of continued improvement in the economy that the Congressional Budget Office forecasts, we will get to full employment again by 2017. We have a long way to go. And at the same time, we have an enormous federal budget deficit. The president's budget says that the deficit this year, the current fiscal year, will be $1.65 trillion, more than 10% of GDP. Now, some of that, of course, is a lousy economy. Some of it is the tax cuts that were put in place last year to help things along. So it will come down over time as long as the economy stays on track. But it will not come down all the way. So when you look at the Congressional Budget Office forecast and you ask them, okay, let's come up with some reasonable estimates of what Congress might do. Assume that they extend the Bush tax cuts. Assume that they pay for Medicare doctors to keep from having their premiums cut. Assume a number of other things that will seem plausible scenarios in the current political environment. And they say that then by 2021, the deficit will be down to 6% of GDP. And between now and then, we will have run up another $12 billion of debt, $12 trillion of debt. $12 trillion of debt. This is not sustainable. It will not last. So we have a situation where we still have a weak economy. We have borrowed an awful lot of money, and we have very low interest rates. And the reason we have low interest rates is partly because of the Federal Reserve, but largely because the Chinese have so much money they can't figure out what to do with it, and they are buying U.S. Treasury debt. And they keep saying, like, maybe this isn't a good investment, and then they look at Japan and they say, oh, God, not that. Or they look at Europe and they say, oh, my God, that's falling apart. And then they think, you know, there's only so much money you can put in the South African rand or something. So we are the, if you will, the tallest midget in the world economy. So we continue to get their savings, and that allows us to have very low interest rates with lots of government borrowing and no clear business plan for how to pay it back. That isn't going to last. I don't know when it's going to end, and I don't know what will make it end, whether it'll be a crash in the value of the dollar or some spike in interest rates or some dark horse presidential candidate who will cast himself or herself as the reincarnation of Ross Perot. But something is going to change this ingredient, and that means that we are engaging in a fundamental rethink about what the federal government does and what the federal budget will be used for. Now, for now, the conversation is a lot discouraging. So we are engaged in this humongous titanic battle of words and billions about 1/6 of the federal budget, the annually appropriated domestic discretionary budget, right? But we all know that we know two things about that. Well, three things about that part of the budget. One is, are there some stupid programs in there? Yes. Is it important to cut those programs? Yes, because it's the only thing that will give the people confidence that the government has a clue what it's doing. Secondly, almost everything good that the government does that's an investment in our future is in that kitty. And third, people think that's spending, and somehow they've convinced themselves that Medicare, Social Security, veterans benefits, that's not spending. So the politicians are engaged in fighting over who can get ahead of whom on that 1/6 of the federal budget, and neither side, neither the president or the Republicans, is talking truth to the American people about the extent of the deficit problem we have and what it's caused by. And it's caused by, of course, entitlement programs that are going faster than they can be sustained given the level of revenues that we now collect. And a lot of us thought last year that the Bowles-Simpson Deficit Reduction Commission, which came up with a very controversial plan. Some parts of it may have been too harsh, some parts may not have been well thought out, but that they had set a baseline for at least what you had to do in order to be honest about the federal government. Well, that just goes to show you that when reporters stop being cynical, we lose our guard and we don't serve our readers. Because that plan has faded into the background. The president isn't embracing very much of it. And the Republicans continue to talk as if we have to cut spending now, domestic discretionary spending, and at some point in the future we'll have our entitlement cuts, but we don't want to talk about that right now. So it's not very constructive. So what does that mean to you? What does that mean to the community colleges of America? Well,
I think it means that lots of unemployment and lots of people who have been unemployed for a long time and lots of parents who are worried about their kids' economic future and lots of 30-year-olds who have been struggling to find their way in this world economy will be knocking on your door. And I know that a number of you have seen very rapid increases in enrollments, although depending on how you look at the numbers, because of California, the recent increase is below. I think you know that your enrollments always go up when the economy sucks. The economy will get better. Some of your enrollment stuff will go away. But the demand for the kind of skills and training that are needed to get a job in the 21st century economy are not diminishing. And the people are looking for a place to get those skills, and many of them will beat their way to your door. But what jobs are you going to train them for? And how will you be flexible enough to cope with an economy that really is changing much more rapidly than most of us anticipated? What happened during the Great Recession was a number of trends that were present and understood seem to have accelerated, whether it's the outsourcing to China, the productivity gains in manufacturing that come from reorganizing the workplace or coming up with new ways to use computerized machines, or the complete renovation of the auto industry. Those things happen much more quickly than most people anticipated. Now, I suppose you could say it's a good thing. You know, would you rather the dentist pull out your tooth rapidly or slowly? But it's not a good thing if you're a worker and like you're measuring your career in 40-year increments and the economy is changing in 2.5 and 3-year increments. So I think there's a big challenge to workers out there, and a lot of them are going to be looking to you. But what do you train them for? Do we really think that allied health is going to continue to grow over the next decade as it has in the past? I mean, last time I checked, the only thing anybody in government agrees on right now that we're spending too much money on health care. Is that boom really going to last? And green jobs? Can someone tell me what a green job is? I mean, I love the idea that we're training all these people for green jobs, but you can't get anybody to tell you what exactly a green job is. And what else do both of those things depend on? Health care and green jobs? Government money that's not going to be coming in the same quantities as it's been coming for the last couple of years. So is that the answer? What about 4-year degrees? Now, there seems to be some evidence that more and more employers are looking for 4-year degrees. I'm not convinced it's because they want the skills of a 4-year degree. It's because they like the credential. And that means that for some people who don't have 4-year degrees, it's going to be harder to get a job, particularly when there's about 6 or 7 people out there for every unfilled job. So what does that mean to you? Does it mean that you all should become 4-year institutions? I know that's kind of a theological question among community college people. My particular rap on that is that you should figure out what you want to do and do it well, and that the worst thing that community colleges do is get these mission statements that let you going to serve your community so widely that I expect one day to see a community college with pre-K and PhD programs, maybe in the same classroom, because you won't be able to finance more than one classroom. But I think it's a big question. Now, does that mean that you should do 4-year degrees? So you know what I think. In most cases, not. Does it mean you should emphasize the transfer function? Well, maybe, but I've always been a little nervous about community colleges going around telling people that we exist to give you a cut rate 2-year start to a 4-year degree, given that, frankly, you know this as well as I do, most people who go to community colleges do not transfer to a 4-year institution. And so I worry a little bit about marketing and leading yourself, leading your customers on by saying you're good at something that maybe you're good at in some states and not in others. And maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe there are a lot of jobs still out there for people with 2-year degrees or specialized training, and we shouldn't make them feel like failures. And you know what else? There's a lot of people who come to community colleges to learn to read and write. And for those of you who've heard me speak before, I think community colleges do themselves and our society a great disservice by not talking about that more. I think every community college in America ought to have an arch, like the McDonald's arch, and it says X million people taught to read and write at community colleges this year. And if the situation in the federal budget is tight, as you know better than I, the situation in the state and local budgets is even worse. Because what happened is a couple of things. One, there's always a lag. The state and local revenues tend to fall a little later than the federal revenues do. Secondly, a number of communities were very dependent on real estate taxes, and you know what happened to them when the housing bust came and the commercial construction business fell apart. And then there's a lot of state governments who are sensitive to capital gains and income taxes, and they fell apart during the Great Recession. And for a while, the federal government came and gave them extra money to tide them over. But that's over. The stimulus is gone. What's appropriated, if you're lucky, will show up, and if you're not lucky, the House and Senate will rescind it. There's not going to be a lot more of that money coming. In the president's budget, in the details we've seen so far, I haven't seen the whole books, they're not out till 10:30, there are a number of grants to state and local governments that are being cut. The only thing that doesn't seem to go down in state and local governments is healthcare costs. And that's going up rapidly, and one of the secrets of the success of the financing of the Obama healthcare plan is to shift people more to Medicaid, which means more money that states are going to have to shell out. And at the same time, we have an obvious crisis in state and local governments that they made pension promises that they didn't set aside enough money to keep. And they assumed that the stock market would go up 8% a year, and it's not going to go up 8% every year. And even if it does, that's not a prudent thing to count on. So a lot of state and local governments are forced to figure out, what do we do with this situation? Revenues are down. They're not back to where they were before the recession. Healthcare costs are up. Taxes, the prospect for rapid increases in property taxes is not present. And we have this pension hole that we have to fill. And by the way, ordinary private citizens, the ones who work for private payrolls and pay the taxes, well, we're getting a little concerned that why has my pension been cut at the Wall Street Journal, and the civil servants whose taxes, who rely on the tax that I pay, have not been cut. So people are thinking that. And that's not going to be good for you. Because when the great squeeze comes, everybody gets squeezed in the state and local governments, in the state legislatures, and you know that you will be on that list too. So let's see. We got an economy that's better, but still lousy. We got a lot of people out of work. We are going to go back to where we were before, eventually, by 2017, but we have no reason to believe that median wages are going to rise rapidly after this thing clears. And we're going to see all the same skill mismatches that we saw before, although perhaps even more intense, because businesses got a lot more sophisticated on technology, and people find it hard to move from one place to another because of the housing bust. And there will be lots more demand for your services, but the demand will change much more rapidly than it has even in the past. And you're going to get fewer resources from the state and federal governments to pay for it. So you might want to think about going into Starbucks or something, a growth industry. The only thing I recommend is, if you think you got problems, stay away from the newspaper industry, because it's even worse. Most people think what we give them they should get for free. At least they're willing to pay a little bit for what you provide. So what is it that I think that community college ought to think about at this moment? Well, one thing is basking in all those nice words about community colleges that you hear from politicians is not going to advance you much, particularly with a Republican Congress. Now, as long as I've been interested in community colleges, I have seen presidents, Republican and Democrat, Federal Reserve chairmen, foundation heads, they all seem to look around, can't figure out what the hell we're going to do about this mess of our economy, and the answer must be community colleges. And they give great speeches. And you know, as some of you have heard me say before, I think everybody ought to wear a t-shirt with a quote from somebody about community colleges. I used to say Alan Greenspan, but that's not so. His capital has fallen a little bit. So you can do Ben Bernanke, and Bill Gates, and Barack Obama, and Jill Biden, and maybe Kevin McCarthy, who you'll hear from, who I understand was a trustee of one of the community college districts in California. So that's good, but that's not enough. You don't need rhetoric. You need money, and you need to convince people that you're doing something that really makes sense. The second thing you need is, even more than you have, and I think it's gotten a lot better in the last decade, is you need some data and accountability to show what you're really doing. And that's hard. It's hard to come up with meaningful data that shows what happens to people who go to community colleges and what programs really work. And what about those non-credit programs? Should they be dismissed in a world which is hung up on diplomas or credentials, or are they actually producing benefits for the people who go to them? I think what role did community colleges play in America over the last 3 years during the Great Recession? You know, what institutions in our society were flexible enough to expand when suddenly there were all these people who wanted to get training, some of whom had federal money to do it? What institutions in our society could say, maybe we ought to do a little less of this and a little more of that? One institutions in our society rose to the challenges of 9/11 and came up with emergency preparedness. Where are the nurses coming from, to the extent that we're still hiring nurses? I think because we burn out the nurses so quickly, we need to produce more or something. Where are they coming from? So who is making the case that one of the things that happened during the Great Recession is pretty much every institution in our society was seen as a failure. People lost trust in government. And my gosh, for good reason. The financial regulators, the business press, the risk management committees of the boards of directors of the biggest banks, I mean, they were all about risk and not about management. People think that the system let them down. People in America had been led to believe that maybe we don't make things as cheaply as they do in China, but the one thing we know how to do is run a financial system. Not. And so you got caught up on that, because even though in your own communities people may relate to you as a place where their nephew went and got a training, or some place where they went to learn how to use Microsoft Excel, or they went to see some entertainment event, or whatever it is that their connection with you is, you're at the risk of getting trapped in that government failed us. All kinds of government failed us. And you have to make a case that you actually didn't fail us. A humble case, the things you did right and the things you did wrong. I think you ought to apologize for all the people you trained for jobs that turned out not to be there. And you ought to emphasize the skills you gave people that are transferable. You ought to talk about the retraining that actually works. And you ought to identify the retraining that doesn't work. And as I said before, you really need to calculate the returns to our society of the remedial or developmental education you do. Third, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the for-profits are a little bit aggressive in Washington. And I think that that's a challenge to you. Now, you got a lucky break, right? I mean, when everybody decided that they were ripping off the federal loan program, it kind of took a little bit of wind out of their sails. But there are two things you have to remember. If you go around the country telling everybody, we're full, we can't handle the students we have, you are making the case that we need something beyond community colleges, and the for-profits will be glad to take that opportunity. And the second thing is, we as a society, as I said, are a little dubious about saying that the government always does things better. That's the rhetoric of the moment. And so there will be for-profit programs that work and will do things better than you. And I think it's incumbent on you to help the Congress and the administration and the press identify what are the things that for-profits are doing well, perhaps working with employers, I don't know what they are, and maybe it's reaching out to people who don't come to the community college. And so you can learn from those experiences. It's not good enough to say, oh my God, they're for-profit, they're terrible. First of all, it's not true, and second of all, it's bad messaging at the moment, right? Fourth, I am really, really worried that in your haste to make the budgets of your institutions balance, in your eagerness to serve the needs of the most attractive employers in your towns, in the hard dollars and cents calculation of what programs are expensive and what aren't, that you will lose sight of one of the fundamental missions of the community college to reach those people who otherwise wouldn't have a chance. The role of the community college in narrowing the gap between winners and losers in our society is very important. And you do. Harvard and the University of Chicago and MIT and all the other elite colleges in America, of which we're so proud, do not do much of that, right? It's not that hard to take the 2% of the really smart kids who somehow managed to get 800 SATs even though they went to a lousy high school, right? That's not the hard part. I mean, any of us could take a really bright kid who came from a lousy high school in a lousy neighborhood and help him get ahead, right? The challenge is, what are we going to do about the rest of them? Who is going to pick up the pieces in our failing K-12 system? Where do people go who graduated from high school and don't have the skills to need a job? If you close that door, you don't deserve to exist. Don't forget that. And finally, Washington today is full of interest groups. Everybody goes to Congress with their basket and says, I know you don't have a lot of money, but I'm worthy. It's not a very good argument, right? I mean, basically, there's a lot of nice to do things. There's some not so nice things to do. The government seems to want to do those too, but put those aside. You don't want to be in that category. You basically do something that's good for our society. So I have two suggestions. One is, I'm not so sure that describing yourself always as kind of the one level of higher education is a smart thing, right? There's a lot to be said for that, and I understand why it's important for both students and parents and faculty to think of yourselves as higher education, and we're as good as the four-year schools, and that's why we need to have a football team and all that, right? But maybe that's not what you're about. Maybe the American Association of Community Colleges should leave that building at DuPont Circle and go split their offices between the AFL-CIO and the Chamber of Commerce. Maybe you ought to think of yourselves not as higher education, but as a solution to the jobs problem, by which I do not mean that you should become vocational high schools. What I mean is what America wants and needs is to give our people the skills and brains and soft learning and all those things that allow them to get good jobs. For some people, it will be working in an auto repair shop with a 2-year degree. For some people, it will be nurses. For some people, it will be going to get a 4-year degree and then a master's in something and being able to be one of those people who competes with the Chinese because we do things that they can't do. But in all cases, what we're talking about is giving people what they need so that they can prosper in a very competitive and scary economy, right? You need to cast yourself as a solution. We don't need to be convinced we have a problem. People know we have a problem. There are not enough good jobs to go around for Americans. Middle-class jobs are hard to find. The Chinese are formidable competitors. Big multinational corporations are moving their workforces overseas because the combination of high productivity, growing markets, and low wages is very attractive. We cannot rest on some gauzy vision of America always rises to the top and we'll rise to this challenge. That's not enough. We need solutions to the fundamental economic problems that we have today. Community colleges can cast themselves as that solution. Do it. Thank you. Okay, so that's the trademark Wessel tough love speech to community colleges. I'm happy to take questions, or if you want to go lobby the Hill, which might be more useful, feel free to do that. I think there's some mics out there. Come on, there must be one person who wants to tell me I'm full of it. Yes, thank you. Right. The questioner asked a very good question. I didn't mention military spending, and she's absolutely right. You know, Alan Simpson, who is rapidly becoming one of the journalist's favorite people, the former senator from Wyoming, who has this wonderful way of speaking. You know, you might not want all his policies, but you definitely want his one-liners. And he was on CNN last Sunday, and he said that if someone talks to you about cutting the deficit, and they don't talk about the four big ones, military spending, Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, you should give them, he said, the green weenie. So I'm watching this on CNN thinking like, oh my God, are they going to get sanctioned by the FCC for some kind of obscenity? Well, it turns out, thanks to the exhaustive research I did on Wikipedia, that the green weenie was a plastic hot dog that the Pittsburgh Pirates fans used to shake at their opponents to jinx them in the 1960s. But no, right. I think that on the military spending thing, actually, there will be substantial cuts. And one of the things that's most interesting to me about some of the new Tea Party Republicans is they're pretty hostile to military spending. There will be a backlash because there's the national security contingency for military spending and there's the defense contractor contingency for military spending. But that's definitely one of the ingredients on the plate, and I should have mentioned it.
Yes, I'm Judith Cawhorn from Mott Community College in Flint, Michigan. And I thought there were a couple of things you said that I was going to ask you if perhaps you could take the challenge of thinking about how you and your profession can connect the dots. On one hand, I totally agree with you that getting in a defensive mode about private schools and saying, you know, they really are gouging students, and that puts us in a bad position. We have ways legislatively that we're trying to do that. But I think it's interesting that on one hand, it is very clear that we don't have money. You stated that. T-shirts aren't enough. We need money. So the reason that we go around saying our doors are full is because of the fact that we are ready and able and capable, and it's been documented through projects like Achieving the Dream, to serve as many students as we can possibly